Hello, welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. I'm joined once again by our VP of Sales and genuinely awesome guy, Bryan. Bryan, thank you for showing up again.
Oh yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, so um, I I hear we've got some stuff to talk about regarding New York City, and so what are you seeing on the ground in terms of questions about that law, and what do we need to talk about to clarify?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is New York Local Law 144 we're talking about, the hiring law for AEDTs. And we've been helping out a lot of clients. That law went into effect about a year ago, if I'm not mistaken. And we've had the privilege to work with a lot of awesome organizations who are, getting everything they need to in place to be compliant with that law. But we're coming up on year two, and there's a little bit of what do we do the second year? Is an annual audit? Does it change? And we're seeing a lot of questions around that. So I'm hoping we can just talk briefly about that and what goes all into it. Maybe before we get into that, just real quick, if you want a high level, what is New York Local Law 144 and what is it hoping to achieve? Would be a great way to kind of set the episode up.
Yeah, so as we all know, like um, AI is now being used all over the place, and AI in particular has been adopted pretty rapidly and for quite a while now in the HR and space, and in particular, not just human resources in general, but hiring and promotion. So AI has been used to sort through candidates who are applying for jobs and decide which, try to weigh in on which candidate is better. Same thing for promotion. And there's tons of different ways that that happens. And one of the worries is, the EEOC, the Federal Enforcement Agency, is will enforce anti-discrimination laws uh, for employers. But New York City recognized that there was some gap when it comes to AI, and these tools that are used may have the potential for bias, and so discrimination can happen even before an employer even sees the candidate. And so they call these tools automated employment decision tools, and in the law, and and the basic idea is that the law in New York City says that if you are an employer in New York City and you're using these hiring tools, they have to be audited for bias. They got to be tested for bias, and that audit has to be kind of an impartial evaluation by an independent auditor. And so that's of course what Babel does, and and so there's a bunch of rules around who can do that audit and what kind of data they can use, but the basic idea is if it's illegal to use one of these tools in New York City if it has not been audited. That's the basic ground rules.
So the the people or the organizations we're auditing are the tool makers, the ADT suppliers. And year one, our audit is, we're auditing what specifically the hiring data and everything that goes into making a decision if around race or gender. And you could probably explain that a little bit more technically. That's the benefit of being a sales guy. I only need to know that much. But the point is that that covered everybody in year one that was using the tool. Can you kind of explain what's going to happen now that they're coming up on year two? And obviously all these providers have their own customers. What do the customers need to take into consideration in addition to the provider for that year two audit?
Okay. So there's a lot of nuances. I'll try to be as clear as possible. So there's basically two kinds of data that the law specifies for testing the system. So the what we call a bias audit, for those who don't know, basically the idea is I have some tool that is going to, candidates are going to come into the tool and some are not going to make it out the other end, right? And the amount that come in or the amount that come out divided by the amount that come in is what we call a selection rate. Maybe 30%, maybe 20%. That's a selection rate. And a bias audit says, okay, instead of taking everybody that comes in, split them up into groups, male, female, just binary at the moment for EEOC. And then there's different race and ethnicities that the federal government has, the official list of groups. You break them up into those groups, and in New York, that has to be intersectional. So you'd consider, white males as a separate category, not just males and females. I mean, you also have to do it in those buckets as well. But the point is, you break them up into these groups, and you look at the selection rate per group. So that's the basic idea, and you want to look for differences there. And the 4/5 rule says if the differences are too much, then you're going to be in trouble. So that's the idea. But you need data to analyze. So the two types of data are: one, historical data, which is I'm an employer and I am just using this tool that some vendor has I've licensed from the vendor, and candidates are coming in and candidates are coming out, and that data is my use of that tool. That's historical data. I've used it to filter candidates. The other kind of data you could use, and that's one way of testing the performance of the system. The other is what's called test data. Test data is when you don't have any demographic information. So let's say you've used it kind of historically, but you don't know the race or ethnicity or gender of these people, or you don't have any information at all, and you had to like collect some data from the internet to like test your system, but it wasn't really how your client, how employers use it. That's considered test data. So that's the two kinds of data. This will become relevant later. Now I'm an employer, and so let's say I'm an employer and I'm using some tool by company X, right? Now I have two options. One is that I can provide that company, that vendor, my historical data. I can give them that data. So if I give them that data and then they go and hire somebody like BABL, let's say, to do an audit, then any company, any employer, including myself, that has given them data, historical data, can not just year one, but every year thereafter, as long as I keep giving that vendor my data to do the testing, I can make use of that audit. And so a vendor can have one audit done, which aggregates all its clients that have given them data. And every single one of those clients that has given them data can use the report that BABL or anybody else gives after the audit's done. And so that's scenario number one. That's like the best scenario, because the vendor does the audit once for a whole bunch of clients, tests the tool, and anybody who's given them historical data, they can make use of that audit. Year one, year two, as long as they keep doing it. Now, there's another scenario where, let's say I'm the employer and I don't want to give that information to the vendor. I don't, because of data privacy, or it's just complicated, or that includes I don't give them the demographic information. Like maybe they have the date, like numbers in the sense of how many they can see who's gone through the system, but they don't know what race or ethnicity or gender they are. Either of those two cases, then the data that the vendor has is what's called test data. And if let's say the vendor hires BABL to do their audit, but all they have available to them is test data. If that's the case, then for the first year, basically, or until such time as a vendor has, or the employer has a statistically significant amount of data, but basically for, let's say, by default about 1 year, I can make use of that vendor's audit, even though I didn't give them any information. But by the end of a year, I have accumulated a lot of use of that tool. And so I have a lot of my own data. I cannot rely in year two on that vendor's audit if I have not contributed information to that vendor. Because it says explicitly in the law, I can't do that. As soon as I get what they call statistically significant amount, me as the employer, a statistically significant amount of historical data through the use of that tool, once I get to that point, I can't rely on that audit anymore. So I have a choice to make. I can either start sending data to the vendor so that the vendor can give that data to, let's say, BABL to do the audit, or I can get my own audit done. And so we've had cases where we've had employers of our clients, which are vendors, also had us do an audit just for them because of this exact problem. And so that's the current scenario. I know it's a little bit complicated, but the basic idea is if you're in the position of an employer using a tool, if you are not giving them, that vendor, information to allow them to do the audit or hire BABL to do the audit, then after on year two, basically, unless you're not using the tool at all, you are going to have to look elsewhere. Either you're going to have to get your own audit done, and we can do those, or you need to start giving your vendor data, historical data, so that they can get it to us to do the audit. That's the scenario.
Yeah. And we'll keep working on my short version of that and your very well explained version of that. We'll try to get it on a nice flyer for everybody. But yeah, it's definitely um, something that as people are learning about regulation, these questions pop up all the time. So unfortunately, not everything is a two-sentence readout. There's nuances to it and decisions that companies need to make that affect other parts of the organization. So it's great that we can explain it very, very deep with the depth of knowledge that we have and just experience doing these audits. And I know we've already got into that second audit with a few clients already. So we're excited to continue to help all of our customers with this problem.
Yeah, I think I mean we should do a handout. I think because there is a pretty simple decision tree. If I'm an auditor, not an auditor, if I'm an employer, so I'm in New York City, I have an office in New York City, and I'm using some tool, which is probably using AI, let's say. I have two scenarios. Am I sharing that data with the vendor or am I not? If I am sharing that data, then my job is to reach out to that vendor and say, "Hey, have you had an audit done? Or you have had an audit done. Are you using my data? So am I okay to make use of this audit?" And if the vendor says, "Yeah, we gave your data, BABL did the audit, it's all good," then it's like, yes, check mark, you're all set. They might say, "Well, we didn't use your data, but do you want us to?" And then you just got to clarify that that they need to use the data. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two is you're not giving the data to them. So then you have a choice. You need to contact your vendor and say, either you're going to be willing to give data over and say, "Hey, please include this in your next audit so that we can be compliant," or let us know who's auditing you so we can get an audit done. Now, given that we're BABL and we audit, please come talk to us because we do this and we're the best at it. But that's the basic choice. You have a decision tree. Either you're giving the data or not. If you're not giving the data to the vendor, you are going to have to figure something out. Now, that was either giving the vendor the data from here on out, or you're going to have to get your own audit. So the decision tree is pretty simple. And the cutoff for when that has to happen is, you can think about a year, but the actual cutoff is if you have like a high throughput, you're like whatever, JP Morgan Chase or something, or you're a really big employer in New York and you have a lot of applications coming through, the level of statistically significant could happen in a month or two, right? And so it's pretty important to actually think through what's your throughput of those tools. Yeah, I think it's critically important. It is kind of nuanced because the law is written in such a way that it's not super transparent, that difference. But the decision tree is actually pretty simple.
Yeah, just real quick. I don't know if it's quantified, but what's statistically significant with some context?
Yes. So that's a really good question. It's not specified, like the Department of Consumer Worker Protection, which is the one who came up with the rules, did not specify what that means. But what they did say is it's sort of like up to the auditor to determine it. And so that's something that we're only kind of recently having to think through because year two is coming up. But the basic idea is, um, if you have less, there's a magic number of like 30 samples, which the EEOC uses, uh, but it's typical of like statistical testing. If you got less than 30, then there's no sense in trying to do any kind of averaging of anything to get a number that makes any sense. You got to have at least over 30. Now that's like the minimum. So that's 30 in a particular category, like in a particular intersectional category. In reality, you have to have, I would say, a more realistic number is like 100 samples or 100 applicants sort of in a particular category. And so there's about 14 categories. So I would say on the order of like 1,000 to 1,500 sort of total applicants, you're starting to get into the statistically significant realm. So, one job posting that gets over 1,000 applicants, you're already starting to get in the area where you could actually get some measurement out of that.
That's really interesting. I think that's new information to me right now. That's good stuff. So, and potentially, and this is the fun part about newly emerging regulation, is if you talk to a different audit firm, it might be slightly different information since it's vague in the law. But yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's up in the air, and um, but yeah, maybe we should put something like that in the handout as well to try to clarify, give people at least a rough benchmark of, but that could come pretty quickly. Those kind of numbers it doesn't take long.
Not at all. And what is nice is I think we've typically been out in front of where a regulation's going in terms of that vague space, being kind of focused on this auditing and assurance of AI systems and algorithmic systems for the last 6 or so years. I think we've always had a little bit more forward leaning. So I say our statistically significant amount will probably hold up uh, as laws become a little bit more robust. And I know there's a lot of action going around that right now with all sorts of different states.
Yeah, I mean, California just passed, or no, they didn't pass. California just has rulemaking that in the HR space, like yeah, we'll save that for different babbling. But there's a lot of things passing now at the state level that is gonna, people are gonna have to worry about this in foreseeable future. Like there's no sense in trying to dodge it.
For sure. I try to keep up as best I can. There's new news feeds coming every direction on it, but I think I've heard Connecticut, Illinois, New York has it back on the table to make it more robust. So this will only become more and more, and then we know with the EU AI Act, anything that affects a decision about employment is going to be flagged as high risk. So um, everyone will have to get really really good at figuring out how to run their business with and build these tools so they're non-biased and for what they're testing for. So yeah, we're again happy that we can be a part of that and validating these products and tools that help businesses become more efficient. That's why they're there. This isn't a slap on the wrist because you're using technology. It's hey, we want to make sure people are treated fairly. That's what everybody wants, and this is a great way to showcase that you're doing things the right way. So um, there's certainly been some other studies I've read where uh, you know, organizations are finding ways to dodge these kind of initial laws. So we don't need to put anybody's name out there on that. But kudos to everyone that's working proactively on doing things the right way. We appreciate that in your business. So there's my little 2 cents on that.
Yeah, yeah. Goes back to that last episode we had about trust. This is one of those ways that you build trustworthiness is to get a second pair of eyes on things, get some expert sort of opinion on how you're doing internally, and that's nothing but good in terms of quality assurance. Um, so you know we'll have once we get this handout done, we should probably link it down below.
Yep.
That will be our our job for the next week is to sort of build that thing out. If you are watching us on YouTube, then if you could like and subscribe, that would be awesome for us. It's going to help us out. If you listen to this on a podcast, then thank you for listening. And we'll see you again next week on Lunchtime Babbling.